He had everything money could buy, but not what the soul longs for. She never asked for much, just to be seen, truly seen. When their worlds collide under the most unexpected circumstances, a quiet storm begins to stir. It's not flashy, it's not loud, but it will challenge everything you think you know about love, worth, and the quiet power of being chosen. And just when you think you figure it out, something happens that changes everything. Where in the world are you watching from? I love knowing how far our stories can reach. Griffin Hale stood at the edge of infinity. Or at least, that's how it felt as he gazed out from the marble terrace of the Hamptons mansion, watching waves crash against rocks that cost more than most people's homes. The champagne in his crystal flute had gone flat an hour ago, just like everything else in his life. At 28, Griffin possessed everything the world told him he should want. His father's tech empire had made him obscenely wealthy before he'd even learned to drive. Magazine covers called him brilliant. Business journals dubbed him a visionary. But standing there, surrounded by the laughter of people who measured friendship in stock portfolios, Griffin felt like he was drowning in silk and gold. Another thrilling evening of intellectual discourse, he muttered, watching his so-called friends through the floor-to-ceiling windows. They were the usual suspects. Trust fund babies who'd never worked a day but spoke about disrupting industries over caviar. Tonight's host, Sebastian Whitmore, was gesturing wildly about his latest venture while cocaine residue still dusted his Armani lapel. Griffin had known these people his entire life. Prep school, Yale, country clubs. They moved through the world like sharks in designer suits, always hungry, never satisfied. And somehow, he'd become one of them without ever choosing to be. The alcohol was flowing freely now, lowering inhibitions and raising stakes. It started as it always did, with boredom disguised as sophistication. Someone mentioned a documentary they'd watched about real people. The conversation devolved into mockery, then curiosity, then something darker. "I bet none of us would last 5 minutes in the real world," laughed Miranda Ashford, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light. "We're so removed from actual humanity." "Speak for yourself," Sebastian scoffed. "I interact with regular people all the time. My driver, my housekeeper, that barista at the coffee shop who always remembers my order." The group erupted in laughter. Griffin felt something twist in his stomach. These people weren't just wealthy, they were hollow. And the worst part, he was no different. That's when Charles Kensington, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, raised his glass with a wicked smile. "Let's make this interesting," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Anyone can throw money at charity galas and feel virtuous. But who among us would actually immerse themselves, really commit to understanding how the other half lives?" The room fell silent. Griffin knew that look in Charles's eyes. It was the same expression he'd worn in boarding school before suggesting they sneak out to vandalize the headmaster's car. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked Miranda, leaning forward with predatory interest. Charles swirled his brandy thoughtfully. "A real challenge. Not just mingling with the masses at some sanitized volunteer event. I'm talking about genuine commitment. Like marriage." The word hung in the air like a blade. Marriage to their crowd meant strategic alliances, prenups thicker than novels, and relationships that looked perfect in society pages but felt like business transactions. Marriage to whom? Griffin found himself asking, though he wasn't sure why. Charles's grin widened. Someone completely outside our world. Someone who would never normally have access to our circles. Make it real. Make it count. 90 days. If you can do it without falling for them, without letting it change you, well, let's just say the bragging rights would be considerable. The group buzzed with excitement. This was entertainment beyond their usual yacht races and polo matches. This was delicious. This was cruel. This was exactly the kind of thing that would cure their chronic boredom. Griffin felt everyone's eyes turn to him. He was the logical choice, unattached, wealthy enough to weather any scandal, and emotionally distant enough to pull it off. They all knew about his carefully curated romantic history. Beautiful, Appropriate women who lasted exactly long enough to avoid gossip, but never long enough to matter. "I'll do it," he heard himself saying, the words escaping before his brain could intervene. The room exploded in cheers and congratulations. Hands clapped his back. Fresh drinks appeared. Someone was already talking about documentation, about making it interesting for their inner circle to follow along. But Griffin barely heard them. Something had shifted the moment he'd accepted. A door had opened to a part of himself he'd kept locked away for years. Maybe this was exactly what he needed, a way to feel something, anything, even if it started as a game. Miles away, in a different world entirely, June Callahan was closing the Riverside Community Library. The old building creaked around her as she turned off lights and checked locks, her routine as familiar as breathing. At 26, June had learned to find beauty in simple things, the way afternoon light filtered through dusty windows, the satisfaction of helping someone find exactly the book they needed, the quiet comfort of being surrounded by thousands of stories. She'd also learned to make herself invisible. Growing up as the overweight girl in a small town had taught her that love was something that happened to other people. People who looked like magazine covers instead of before photos. People who commanded attention instead of deflecting it. June's world was small but safe. Her modest apartment. Her job at the library. Caring for her mother, whose arthritis was getting worse each winter. She'd built a life that didn't require anyone else's approval or attention. It was lonely sometimes, but it was hers. She locked the library's front door and paused on the steps, looking up at the stars barely visible through the city's glow. For just a moment, she let herself wonder what it would feel like to matter to someone, to be chosen, to be seen as more than just a kind face behind a circulation desk. "Maybe someday," she whispered to the night sky, then immediately felt foolish for the thought. Neither Griffin nor June could have imagined that in a few short weeks, their worlds would collide. That a cruel dare would become the first chapter of something neither expected. That sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the ugliest intentions. But that's how love works sometimes. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't wait for perfect circumstances. It simply arrives uninvited and unexpected, ready to transform everything it touches. Even when it starts as a lie. June woke on her wedding day, feeling like she was floating between two worlds. The morning light streaming through her small bedroom window seemed different somehow, softer, more golden, as if the universe itself was celebrating this impossible moment. She lay still for several minutes, afraid that moving too quickly might shatter the dream and send her tumbling back to reality. But the simple white dress hanging on her closet door was real. The nervous flutter in her stomach was real. And somehow, impossibly, Griffin Hale wanting to marry her was real too. Her friend Maria had worked magic with that dress, spending weeks hand-sewing delicate pearls along the modest neckline and creating sleeves that made June feel graceful instead of hidden. It wasn't the designer gown she'd imagined as a little girl, it was better. It was made with love, with careful attention to every curve and imperfection, designed to make her feel beautiful exactly as she was. June's hands trembled as she slipped into the dress. In the mirror, she saw someone she barely recognized. Not a different person, but perhaps the person she'd always been underneath the layers of insecurity and doubt. Her mother had insisted on doing her hair, arthritic fingers working slowly but lovingly to create an elegant updo that framed June's face like a Renaissance painting. "My beautiful girl," her mother whispered, tears already threatening to spill. "I never thought I'd see this day." The confession hit June like a gentle punch to the chest. Her mother had given up hope of seeing her daughter married. The realization should have hurt, but instead it made this moment feel even more precious, more miraculous. Griffin had chosen a small garden venue across town intimate, he'd called it, with string lights and white roses that looked almost too perfect against the green backdrop. When June arrived, she noticed the photographers immediately. They were trying to be discreet, hiding behind trees and lurking near the entrance, but their presence felt obvious and intrusive. "Just for memories," Griffin explained when she questioned him, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Every bride deserves beautiful wedding photos." Something in his tone, made June's stomach tighten, but she pushed the feeling away. This was her wedding day. She deserved to feel happy, to feel chosen, even if part of her couldn't quite believe it was real. Her mother's wheelchair had been decorated with white ribbons, and as June walked down the short aisle, she could hear her mother's quiet sobs of joy. The sound broke something open in June's chest. All those years of watching other people get their happy endings, and now, somehow, it was her turn. Griffin stood waiting under an arch of climbing roses, looking devastatingly handsome in his perfectly tailored suit. But as June approached, she caught something in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty, maybe even regret, that disappeared so quickly she wondered if she'd imagined it. From somewhere behind the rose bushes, she could hear muffled laughter. Griffin's friends, she assumed, though she couldn't understand what was funny about a wedding ceremony. The sound made her skin crawl, but Griffin seemed oblivious to it, focused entirely on her face as she reached his side. The vows were brief and simple. Griffin spoke about new beginnings and unexpected joy, his words carefully chosen but somehow hollow, like he was reciting lines from a play he'd never read. June found herself studying his face as he spoke, searching for the man who had courted her so persistently, who had made her believe in fairy tales again. When her turn came, June's words tumbled out from her heart, promises of loyalty and friendship, of building something real together, of loving him exactly as he was. As she spoke, she watched Griffin's composure crack slightly, his jaw tightening, as if her sincerity was physically painful. The photographer captured the moment when Griffin hesitated before saying, "I do." For just a heartbeat, he stared into June's eyes, and something passed between them that neither expected. Fear, recognition, a glimpse of the real person hiding behind their carefully constructed facades. When they kissed to seal their marriage, June gripped Griffin's hand tightly, surprised by how cold his fingers were despite the warm afternoon. Griffin swallowed hard, as if the simple contact had triggered something he wasn't prepared for. The dinner afterward felt like a performance. Griffin made conversation about books and movies, asking questions that seemed designed to keep them talking, but revealed nothing about himself. June found herself cataloging the silences between his words, the way his laugh sounded just slightly forced, the way he kept glancing toward the darkened corners of the garden, as if expecting someone to appear. She wanted to ask him what was wrong, to understand the distance she felt despite sitting inches away from him. But this was her wedding day, and she'd waited 26 years for it. She wasn't going to ruin it by demanding answers to questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered. That night, in Griffin's penthouse apartment that felt more like a museum than a home, he insisted on separate bedrooms out of respect. June nodded and smiled, but inside she wondered if he found her too repulsive to share a bed, even platonically. Around midnight, she heard sounds from the bathroom they shared, muffled sobs that Griffin clearly thought no one could hear. June pressed her ear to the wall, her heart breaking for this man who seemed to carry so much pain. She wanted to knock, to offer comfort, to ask why someone who seemed to have everything was crying alone on his wedding night. She didn't know about the sleepless nights that had plagued Griffin since childhood, or about the father who had taught him that emotions were weakness, or about the mother who had been too lost in her own prescription haze to notice her son was drowning. All June knew was that her new husband was suffering, and her instinct was to help. The next morning, she woke early and made pancakes from scratch, humming an old lullaby her grandmother used to sing. The melody filled the sterile kitchen with warmth, transforming the space into something that felt almost like home. When Griffin emerged, hair mussed and eyes still red from his sleepless night, he stopped in the doorway. Something about the scene, June moving gracefully around his kitchen, singing softly to herself, creating something nurturing and sweet, hit him like a punch to the solar plexus. For a moment, he felt safe, protected, like maybe this strange woman who had married him could build walls around his broken heart that even he couldn't breach. He didn't let it show, of course. Griffin had spent years perfecting the art of emotional camouflage. But something had shifted during that first night as June's husband, something that made him feel both terrified and oddly hopeful. Over the following days, they fell into a routine. June would introduce him to people at community events, her voice proud when she said, "My husband." Griffin found himself smiling with genuine warmth at these moments, even as part of him cringed with shame. He was beginning to understand that June wasn't just kind, she was the kind of person who made other people want to be better. When she looked at him, she saw potential instead of problems, hope instead of damage. One evening, as they sat on his balcony watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and rose, June turned to him with that direct gaze that always made him feel exposed. "You have sad eyes," she said quietly, her voice gentle but unflinching. "But they're beautiful eyes." Griffin felt something crack open in his chest. No one had ever called any part of him beautiful while acknowledging his pain. The combination of acceptance and attraction, of seeing his flaws and choosing to stay anyway, was more than he knew how to handle. He was supposed to be playing a role. He was supposed to remain detached. But June was making that impossible, one small kindness at a time. The magazine cover hit June like a physical blow. Standing in the fluorescent-lit checkout line at Savamart, surrounded by the mundane ritual of grocery shopping, she found herself staring at her own face splashed across the front of Celebrity Secrets magazine. The headline screamed in bold red letters, "Millionaire marries obese woman for love or a bet." Time stopped. The world around her, the beeping scanners, the chattering customers, the elevator music, faded to white noise. All she could see was that horrible word, obese, printed next to a photograph of her wedding day that she'd never seen before. Someone had been watching. Someone had been documenting her most precious moment without her knowledge. June's hands trembled as she reached for the magazine, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone in the store could hear it. The article inside was worse than the cover. Unnamed sources. Speculation about Griffin's motives. A detailed analysis of her body weight and appearance that made her feel stripped naked and examined under a microscope. But it was the sidebar that destroyed her completely. A collection of social media posts from Griffin's social circle, screenshots of conversations that painted her marriage as the punchline to some elaborate joke. Laughing emojis, cruel comments about her appearance, references to a bet that made her stomach turn to lead. June abandoned her shopping cart right there in the checkout line and drove home with shaking hands, the magazine burning like poison on the passenger seat beside her. Meanwhile, across town in his glass tower office, Griffin's phone was exploding with notifications. Text messages, calls, emails, all of them from people who thought the scandal was hilarious. His old prep school friends were having a field day, sharing memes and making jokes about his social experiment. The cruel amusement in their messages made him feel physically sick. But Griffin had perfected the art of indifference years ago. He deleted the messages without reading them, turned off his phone, and tried to focus on work. This would blow over. Scandals always did in their circles. Something more interesting would capture the media's attention, and this would become ancient history. He was wrong. When Griffin arrived home that evening, he found June sitting at his dining table with the magazine spread open in front of her like evidence at a crime scene. Her face was blotchy from crying, but her eyes were dry now, hardened into something he'd never seen before. "Is it true?" she asked without preamble, her voice steady and cold. Griffin's first instinct was to lie, to smooth things over with charm and deflection the way he always had. "June, you can't believe everything you read in those rags. They make up stories to sell copies. Half of what they print is complete fiction." "That's not what I asked." June's voice cut through his explanation like a blade. "I asked if it's true. Was our marriage a bet?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. Griffin found himself studying her face, looking for the soft, trusting woman who had made him pancakes and called his eyes beautiful. This version of June was different, stronger, more dangerous. This June demanded truth instead of accepting pretty lies. "Of course not," he said, but even he could hear how hollow it sounded. "Yes, I have wealthy friends who like to gossip and cause drama. But what we have, what we built, that's real, June." She stared at him for a long moment, and Griffin felt like she was seeing through every defense he'd ever constructed. Finally, she nodded slowly, but it wasn't acceptance. It was resignation. "I want to believe you," she said quietly. "God help me. I want to believe you so badly that I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. But Griffin, if I find out you're lying to me, if I discover that this," she gestured between them, "is some kind of game to you, I will never forgive you. Do you understand?" Griffin nodded, relief flooding through him. She was giving him a chance. They could get through this. But the internet had other plans. Within hours, the story had exploded across social media. Twitter was full of memes comparing June to fairy tale ogres. Instagram influencers were making reaction videos analyzing their unlikely pairing. The comments sections were cesspools of cruelty that made Griffin's stomach turn. Then someone dug up an old interview Griffin had given to Forbes 2 years earlier, back when he was promoting his father's latest tech venture. The interviewer had asked about his personal life, and Griffin's response played on a loop across every gossip channel. "Marriage? Not interested. The whole institution is just an elaborate game, isn't it? People playing house until they get bored and move on to the next player." When June saw the clip, something inside her died. She didn't confront Griffin this time. She simply packed a bag and drove to her mother's house, leaving only a note on his pillow: "I need time to think." Griffin found her 3 days later, volunteering at the library's children's reading hour, surrounded by kids who adored her storytelling voice. She looked smaller somehow, like the light that had always radiated from her had dimmed to barely a flicker. He tried everything. Flowers arrived at the library every day, elaborate arrangements that must have cost more than June made in a month. Rare first edition books appeared on her desk with handwritten notes apologizing for the media circus. He donated anonymously to the library's renovation fund, thinking that supporting something she loved might prove his sincerity. But June saw through every gesture. "You can buy anything, can't you?" she said when he cornered her after the library closed one evening. "Flowers, books, buildings, silence. You think money can purchase truth, but it can't, Griffin. The only thing I want from you costs nothing and is worth everything, and you won't give it to me." Her words hit him like a physical blow. Griffin realized she wasn't asking for grand gestures or expensive gifts. She was asking for honesty, for vulnerability, for the one thing he'd never learned how to give. That night, June's mother called Griffin and asked him to come over for coffee. He found the older woman waiting on her small front porch, wrapped in a faded quilt, her eyes sharp despite her physical frailty. "Sit down, son," she said, and something in her tone made Griffin obey without question. "I know what it looks like when someone's running from their own heart," she continued, studying his face with the wisdom of someone who had loved and lost and survived it all. "I know because I spent 10 years running for mine after June's father left. I built walls so high that I nearly missed out on most beautiful parts of life." Griffin found himself unable to look away from her weathered hands as she spoke. "My daughter loves you," she said simply. "I can see it in the way she lights up when she talks about you, in the way she's been crying herself to sleep since this mess started. But love isn't enough if you're not brave enough to be honest about who you are and what you've done." For the first time in years, Griffin felt truly seen. Not as a wealthy bachelor or a business heir or scandal in the making, but as a broken man who was terrified of letting anyone get close enough to hurt him. June returned home the next day, but everything between them had changed. She established rules, separate bedrooms, no physical affection, no pretending their marriage was anything more than a legal arrangement until Griffin could prove he deserved her trust. Something shifted in Griffin then. Instead of his usual weekend parties with Sebastian and the gang, he started showing up at the community library on Saturday mornings, asking how he could help. He organized reading programs, funded literacy initiatives, and slowly began to understand what it meant to contribute to something bigger than himself. June watched from a distance, seeing glimpses of the man she'd fallen in love with beneath the layers of privilege and pretense. But just as she was beginning to hope again, the final blow came. A leaked bank statement showed a wire transfer from Charles Kensington to Griffin's personal account, payment for entertainment services rendered. The amount was obscene, more money than June would see in a lifetime, transferred just days after their wedding. When June confronted him with the evidence, Griffin's face went white. There was no explanation that could make this right, no lie that could cover this truth. "Get out," June said, her voice deadly calm. "Get out of my home, get out of my life, and don't you dare come back." Griffin left without a word, because for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to say. Griffin's penthouse felt like a mausoleum when he returned. 50 floors above the city, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, he had never felt more isolated in his life. The space that had once represented success and sophistication now felt like a prison made of marble and glass. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from Sebastian and the gang, each notification another needle of mockery piercing what remained of his conscience. They thought the whole situation was hilarious, the fact that he'd actually seemed to care about the fat librarian as they'd taken to calling June. Their amusement felt like acid in his veins. "Well, that was entertaining while it lasted," Sebastian texted, followed by a string of laughing emojis. "Though I have to admit, you had us worried there for a minute. You actually looked like you were falling for your own act." Charles chimed in with his own brand of cruelty. The comedy lasted longer than any of us expected. Oscar-worthy performance, really. When do you want to celebrate properly? Griffin stared at the messages, waiting for the familiar surge of cynical amusement that usually accompanied his friends' jokes. It didn't come. Instead, he felt something he'd never experienced before when looking at their words: disgust. Not just at them, but at himself. At the man he'd been, at the game he'd agreed to play, at the callous disregard for another human being's heart that had seemed so entertaining just months ago. For the first time in his adult life, Griffin didn't respond to his friends' messages. He couldn't. The words that would have come naturally before, the casual cruelty, the shared laughter at June's expense, felt impossible to form. Across town, June was learning to rebuild her life one small piece at a time. The community library had become her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the simple act of helping others discover stories that might heal their own wounds. When the children's reading hour came around each week, she poured all the love she had nowhere else to put into those eager young faces. "Miss June, will you read us the dragon story again?" asked little Emma, a gap-toothed 6-year-old who reminded June of herself at that age, shy, a little awkward, but hungry for magic. June's smile was genuine as she opened the worn picture book. "Of course, sweetheart. But this time, let's all roar like dragons together, okay?" The children's laughter filled the library's children's section, and for a moment, June felt something close to peace. She was building something meaningful here, something that mattered beyond the wreckage of her marriage. But peace, June was learning, was a fragile thing. The call came on a Tuesday morning while she was cataloging new donations. Her mother had collapsed at home, and the paramedics were rushing her to St. Mary's Hospital. June's world tilted on its axis as she grabbed her keys and ran. The next few days passed in a blur of hospital corridors, machines that beeped and hummed, and the devastating realization that her mother's condition was far worse than anyone had realized. The arthritis had been masking something more sinister, a rare autoimmune condition that had been silently attacking her organs for months. June barely left her mother's bedside, holding those familiar hands that had braided her hair and wiped her tears and made her believe she was worthy of love even when the world insisted otherwise. What June didn't know was that Griffin had found out about her mother's hospitalization. He'd been quietly keeping track of her life from a distance, not to intrude, but simply because he couldn't seem to stop caring. When the news reached him through a mutual acquaintance at the community center, something inside him broke open. He came to the hospital every day, but he never went inside. Instead, he sat in his car in the parking garage, sometimes for hours, just knowing he was close if June needed anything. He couldn't offer comfort. He'd forfeited that right when he'd built their entire relationship on a lie, but he could bear witness to her pain from afar. Griffin was there, invisible in the shadows, when June's mother passed away on a Thursday afternoon. He watched through the hospital windows as June emerged, her face ravaged by grief, supported by the few friends who had gathered to help her through the darkest moment of her life. He wanted to go to her. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to offer comfort, to hold her, to tell her that she wasn't alone. But he'd lost the right to be her solace when he'd chosen cruelty over kindness in those early days of their marriage. Instead, Griffin went home and wrote. For hours, he poured his heart onto paper, an apology, an explanation, a confession of feelings he'd never allowed himself to acknowledge. He wrote about how June's mother had seen through his defenses in a single conversation, how she'd shown him more maternal warmth in 5 minutes than his own mother had in 28 years. The letter was 12 pages long when he finished, raw and honest in ways that terrified him. He hand-delivered it to June's apartment and left it by her door, knowing she might not read it, but needing to try. June found the letter when she returned from making funeral arrangements. She held the thick envelope for a long moment, Griffin's familiar handwriting blurring through her tears. Then, without reading a single word, she tore it into pieces and threw it away. Some wounds were too fresh for forgiveness. Some betrayals cut too deep for pretty words to heal. Griffin didn't know about the unread letter when he showed up at his old social circle's gathering the following weekend. Sebastian had insisted he come, claiming Griffin needed to get back to normal after his temporary insanity. The party was everything Griffin remembered, excessive, meaningless, full of people who confused wealth with worth. He found himself sitting next to Veronica Walsh, a model he dated briefly 2 years earlier. She was beautiful, sophisticated, exactly the kind of woman his old self would have pursued. I heard about your little experiment, Veronica said, trailing her perfectly manicured fingers along his arm. It must have been exhausting pretending to care about someone so ordinary. Griffin looked at her, really looked, and felt absolutely nothing. No attraction, no interest, no desire to fall back into the familiar patterns of his old life. June had changed something fundamental in him, and there was no going back to the man he'd been before. "Excuse me," he said, standing abruptly. "I need to leave." He walked out of the party without explanation, ignoring Sebastian's calls behind him. In the elevator down to the lobby, Griffin caught his reflection in the polished steel doors and barely recognized himself. The man staring back looked haunted, broken, but somehow more real than he'd ever been. That night, Griffin did something he'd never done in his adult life. He made an appointment with a therapist. Dr. Sarah Chen's office was nothing like what Griffin had expected. Instead of the sterile, intimidating space he'd imagined, it was warm and comfortable, filled with soft lighting, and the kind of furniture that invited honesty. "Tell me why you're here," Dr. Chen said simply. Griffin found himself talking about his childhood for the first time in years. About hiding under the stairs while his parents screamed at each other. About a father who showed love through criticism, and a mother who numbed her pain with prescription pills and emotional distance. About learning that survival meant never letting anyone close enough to hurt you. "I think," Griffin said slowly, the words feeling foreign on his tongue, "I never learned how to love someone. I only learned how to protect myself from being loved." It was the most honest thing he'd said in years. Meanwhile, June was learning to navigate grief while the media continued to dissect her failed marriage. Most days, she ignored the speculation and gossip, but occasionally a headline would catch her attention. So she was watching when Griffin appeared on a late-night talk show, looking tired and older than his years. The host asked about his recent unconventional marriage, clearly expecting salacious details or cruel jokes. Instead, Griffin's response stopped June's breath in her throat. "June's mother was an extraordinary woman," Griffin said, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "In the short time I knew her, she showed me more maternal kindness than I'd experienced in my entire life. She saw who I could be instead of who I was, and she loved her daughter with a fierceness that was beautiful to witness. Losing her, it's a tragedy for everyone who knew her, but especially for June. The interviewer tried to steer the conversation back to scandal, but Griffin wouldn't be moved. He spoke about June's work at the library, her impact on the community, her capacity for forgiveness and grace. He never mentioned the bet, never made excuses for his behavior, never tried to paint himself as anything other than someone who had failed someone he cared about. June found herself crying for the first time since the funeral, but these tears felt different. For the first time, she heard something in Griffin's voice that sounded like truth. 2 weeks later, a package arrived at the library addressed to the children's reading program. Inside were dozens of brand new picture books, each one carefully selected and age-appropriate. There was no note, no return address, but June recognized the selection immediately. Someone had been paying attention to which stories the children loved most. Hidden inside the copy of The Velveteen Rabbit was a small card with a single line written in Griffin's handwriting, "For someone who taught me how to listen." June held the card for a long time, feeling something shift in her chest. The anger was still there, and the hurt, but underneath it all was a tiny seed of possibility. That night, for the first time since her mother's death, June sat down and wrote a letter. It was short, careful, but it was a beginning. "Griffin," she wrote, "I received the books. The children will love them. Thank you." She signed it simply June and mailed it before she could change her mind. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the first step towards something that might, someday, become healing. June's letter arrived on a Thursday morning, carried by the same postal service that had delivered Griffin's unread confession weeks earlier. But whereas had been thick with desperate explanations, hers was elegantly simple, a single sheet of cream-colored paper with words that made his heart stop. "If you want to talk, meet me at Fig Tree Square. Saturday, 2 o'clock. That was all. No signature beyond her initial, no promises or threats or conditions. Just an invitation that felt more precious than any business contract Griffin had ever signed. Saturday couldn't come fast enough, yet it arrived with terrifying speed. Griffin stood in front of his bathroom mirror that morning, hardly recognizing the man staring back at him. The past few months had carved hollows under his cheekbones and painted shadows beneath his eyes. He'd lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, and his usual perfectly styled hair hung limply around a face that had learned what real sorrow looked like. He'd shaved carefully, wanting to look presentable, but not wanting to seem like he was trying too hard. Every choice felt momentous. Which shirt would communicate respect without presumption? Which cologne would remind her of better times without seeming manipulative? Fig Tree Square was a small pocket park in June's neighborhood, the kind of place where mothers brought toddlers to feed ducks and elderly couples shared afternoon newspapers on weathered benches. The massive fig tree at its center had been there for over a century, its gnarled branches creating a natural cathedral of green shade. Griffin arrived 10 minutes early and found June already there, sitting on their bench, though he caught himself before thinking of it as theirs. She looked smaller than he remembered, wrapped in a cardigan that seemed too large for her frame, her hair pulled back in the simple ponytail she'd always worn when she was nervous. The sight of her hit him like a physical blow. For months, he'd been surviving on memories and glimpses caught from afar. Having her here, real and close enough to touch, made him realize how utterly empty his world had become without her presence. They walked in silence at first, following the meandering path that circled the small pond. Griffin found himself cataloging everything: the way her shoes made soft sounds on the gravel, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the familiar scent of her shampoo that brought back memories of morning conversations over coffee. Finally, June stopped walking and turned to face him. "Why?" she asked, and the single word carried the weight of everything that had happened between them. Griffin had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, crafting eloquent explanations and heartfelt speeches. But faced with June's direct gaze, all his prepared words crumbled. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know why I agreed to something so cruel, why I thought I could play with someone's heart like it was a game piece. But I want to understand. I'm trying to understand." June nodded slowly, as if she'd expected this answer. "Tell me about the beginning," she said. "Tell me the truth about why you approached me." Griffin felt like he was performing surgery on himself without anesthesia, but he owed her nothing less than complete honesty. He told her about the bet, about the cruel laughter of his friends, about his own empty arrogance that had made another person's pain seem entertaining. "It started because I was vain and bored and broken in ways I didn't even recognize," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But June, somewhere along the way, it became impossible not to fall in love with you. Not with the idea of you, not with the challenge you represented, but with who you actually are." June's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "How do I know that's true? How do I know this isn't just another performance, another part of the game?" Griffin reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a worn envelope, June's mother's letter, the one he'd carried with him since the day it arrived. His hands shook as he held it out to her. "Your mother wrote to me after our first conversation on her porch," he said. "I've read it so many times the paper is falling apart. She saw who I could become before I even knew that person existed. I kept it because it was the first time someone believed I might be worth saving." June took the letter with trembling fingers, recognizing her mother's careful handwriting even through her tears. As she read, Griffin watched her face transform, surprise giving way to something that might have been hope. "I need time," June said finally, folding the letter carefully. "I need to think about all of this." Griffin nodded, expecting rejection, but grateful for the possibility of consideration. "I understand. But June, would you let me help with the library projects? Not as your husband, not with any expectations, just as someone who wants to contribute to something meaningful." It was a small beginning, but June agreed. Over the following weeks, they fell into a careful rhythm of collaboration. Griffin would arrive at the library each morning with coffee for the staff and a willingness to do whatever needed doing, shelving books, organizing children's events, painting walls that had needed fresh color for years. June watched him from a safe distance, looking for signs of the old Griffin underneath this newer, humbler version. She saw glimpses of his former arrogance occasionally, but they were quickly checked by something that looked genuinely like self-awareness. The moment that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon during story time. Griffin had been helping June set up chairs when 8-year-old Marcus Thompson, whose parents had been fighting loudly about their divorce in the parking lot, lashed out at the nearest target. "Why do we have to listen to the fat princess?" Marcus shouted, his young face twisted with the kind of cruelty that usually comes from pain. "She's not even pretty." The room fell silent. June's face went white, and Griffin watched her reflexively shrink into herself the way she had during those first difficult weeks of media attention. But this time, she wasn't alone. Griffin knelt down to Marcus's eye level, his voice gentle but firm. "Marcus, I can see you're upset about something, and that's okay. But June is one of the kindest, smartest, most beautiful people I know. When we're hurting, it's easy to try to hurt others, but it never makes us feel better. Would you like to talk about what's really bothering you?" The exchange was captured on video by another parent and posted to social media within hours. The clip went viral overnight, but this time, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Thousands of comments praised Griffin for defending his wife with such grace and dignity. The headline read, "Millionaire husband defends wife from body shaming with perfect response." More importantly, June received hundreds of letters from women thanking her for existing publicly, for showing them that love and respect weren't limited to bodies that fit narrow cultural standards. Griffin quietly donated the money needed to complete the library's renovation, not as a grand gesture, but as a practical contribution to work that mattered. When June discovered his involvement, she didn't confront him. Instead, she simply began smiling more often when he was around. The invitation came in November, a charity gala for literacy programs that June had been asked to speak at. Griffin had been invited separately, but he wouldn't go without her permission. "Would you like to attend together?" he asked carefully. "As partners in this work, if nothing else." June considered for a long moment before nodding. "As partners," she agreed. The evening was magical in ways neither had expected. June's speech about the transformative power of stories brought the audience to their feet, and Griffin felt his chest swell with pride watching her command the room with such grace and intelligence. As they walked to the car afterward, Griffin offered his arm out of habit, then froze, afraid he'd overstepped. But June surprised him by taking it, her fingers warm against his jacket sleeve. "Griffin," she said softly as they reached her door, I think maybe you're learning how to be the person you were meant to be all along." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was recognition and hope, and the possibility that some mistakes could be transformed into something beautiful if the person making them was brave enough to change. Griffin squeezed her hand gently before letting go. "I'm trying, June. Every day, I'm trying to become someone worthy of the love you showed me." As he drove away, both of them carried the same thought. Maybe, just maybe, this story wasn't over yet. The video of Griffin defending June spread across the internet like wildfire, but this time, the flames brought warmth instead of destruction. Within 48 hours, major news outlets were picking up the story, and Griffin's phone rang constantly with interview requests from producers who saw ratings gold in his transformation narrative. The Marla Stevens Show was America's most-watched morning talk show, and Marla herself was known for her ability to make even the most guarded celebrities reveal their deepest truths. When her producer called Griffin with an invitation to discuss modern masculinity and standing up to bullying, his first instinct was to decline. "I don't know if I'm ready for that level of scrutiny," Griffin confessed to June as they walked through the library's newly renovated children's section. "What if I say the wrong thing? What if I make things worse for you?" June stopped arranging picture books on a low shelf and looked at him with those clear, assessing eyes that had always seen straight through his defenses. "Griffin, you have a platform now, whether you want it or not. The question is, what are you going to do with it?" Her words carried the weight of challenge and trust in equal measure. She was giving him permission to step into the spotlight, but more than that, she was expressing faith that he might use that light to illuminate something meaningful instead of just basking in its glow. The morning of the interview, Griffin sat in the green room of the television studio, his hands trembling slightly as he watched Marla Stevens through the monitor. She was interviewing a young actress about her latest romantic comedy, and her warm, encouraging demeanor did little to calm his nerves. When Griffin walked onto the set, the studio audience greeted him with polite applause that felt cautious, as if they were withholding judgment until they heard what he had to say. Marla's smile was professional but genuinely curious as she settled into her chair across from him. "Griffin Hale," she began, her voice carrying the perfect blend of warmth and journalistic probing that had made her famous. "6 months ago, you were known primarily as a wealthy bachelor with a reputation for short-term relationships. Today, you're here because of a video that shows you defending your wife with remarkable grace and maturity. What changed?" Griffin had prepared for this question, but sitting under the bright lights with millions of people watching, his rehearsed answer felt inadequate. Instead, he found himself speaking from a place of raw honesty that surprised even him. "I think I spent most of my life addicted to validation from people whose opinions ultimately didn't matter," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his words. "I was so focused on being seen as successful, as desirable, as untouchable, that I forgot how to be human. June didn't just teach me how to love someone else, she taught me how to recognize when I was living a lie." Marla leaned forward, clearly sensing there was more to uncover. "The internet has been full of speculation about your marriage. Some people have suggested it began as something less than romantic. How do you respond to those claims?" Griffin felt his throat tighten. This was the moment of truth, the crossroads where he could either continue building on a foundation of honesty or retreat into the comfortable armor of public relations speak. "I made mistakes," he said quietly. "Terrible mistakes that hurt someone I've come to love deeply. I can't change how things began, but I can take responsibility for the man I was and work every day to become the man June deserves." The studio fell silent. Griffin could feel the weight of thousands of eyes watching him, judging him, deciding whether his contrition was genuine or just another performance. Marla's next question caught him off guard. Tell me about shame, Griffin. You mentioned it in your recent therapy interviews. How has confronting that emotion changed you? Griffin's breath caught. He hadn't expected her to have done such thorough research, to have found the small interviews he'd given to psychology journals about his therapeutic journey. Shame is like a poison that seeps into everything, he said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. It makes you believe you're not worthy of love, so you either push people away or you manipulate them into staying. I've spent my whole life running from the feeling that I wasn't good enough, and in the process, I became someone who wasn't good enough. The audience was completely quiet now, hanging on every word. Griffin realized he wasn't just talking to them. He was talking to June wherever she might be watching, trying to show her that the work he'd been doing on himself was real and ongoing. When the interview aired the following day, the response was overwhelming. Social media flooded with comments from people who recognized their own struggles in Griffin's words. The hashtag #RealTalk began trending as others shared their own stories of confronting shame and working toward authentic change. But the most surprising response came from an unexpected source. A major fashion brand that specialized in inclusive sizing reached out with an offer to make Griffin their spokesperson for a new campaign about redefining masculinity and beauty standards. The financial offer was substantial, more money than Griffin needed, but enough to fund every literacy program in the city. Yet when he read the contract, something felt wrong. The campaign wanted to use his story, his transformation, his relationship with June as a marketing tool. "I can't do it," he told his publicist during a tense phone call. "This isn't about selling clothes or building my brand. If I'm going to talk about these things, it has to be because they matter, not because they're profitable." Instead, Griffin donated what would have been his fee to a nonprofit organization focused on body positivity and self-esteem education for young people. The gesture went largely unnoticed by the media, which was exactly what he wanted. June watched all of this unfold from a careful distance, her emotions a complicated tangle of pride and wariness. She could see that Griffin's transformation seemed genuine, but years of being invisible had taught her to be suspicious of sudden spotlight. Was this real change, or was Griffin simply getting better at being the kind of person people wanted him to be? The media attention brought new pressures neither of them had anticipated. Suddenly, they were being labeled as a symbol couple, proof that love could transcend societal beauty standards and that redemption was possible for anyone willing to do the work. Magazine editors called June daily, offering substantial sums for photo shoots and interviews. The covers they described sounded empowering on the surface: real women, real love, and beauty beyond size. But June instinctively recoiled from the idea of being packaged and sold as inspiration. "I'm afraid of becoming a product," she admitted to Griffin one evening as they organized books for the next day's story time. What if all of this attention turns our story into something performative? What if we start living for the cameras instead of for ourselves? Griffin set down the stack of picture books he'd been sorting and looked at her with complete understanding. "You don't owe anyone a fairy tale ending, June. Not them, not me, not even yourself. Whatever happens between us, it should happen because we choose it, not because it makes a good story." His words released something tight in June's chest. For weeks, she'd felt the pressure of public expectation weighing on her shoulders, as if the world was watching to see whether she would forgive Griffin and complete the redemption narrative everyone seemed to want. They began attending a weekly reading workshop at the community center, a small group of adults who met to practice reading aloud and discuss literature. Griffin had never read to children before, but something about the intimacy of the circle, the trust in young faces looking up at him, moved him in unexpected ways. The first time his voice broke while reading The Velveteen Rabbit, he was mortified. But the children simply waited patiently for him to compose himself, and when he finished the story, 6-year-old Sophia patted his hand and said, "It's okay to cry when stories are beautiful, Mr. Griffin." A local reporter who happened to be volunteering that day captured the moment in a brief video that she posted without fanfare. The clip showed Griffin's genuine emotion, his careful interaction with the children, and June watching from across the room with something that might have been growing trust. When the reporter approached June afterward and asked the question everyone wanted answered, Have you forgiven him? June's response was characteristically honest. I'm still listening, she said simply. Forgiveness isn't a destination you arrive at, it's a process you work through. Right now, I'm listening to his actions, to his consistency, to whether the man he's becoming can be trusted with my heart. The phrase, "I'm still listening," resonated with thousands of women who had been hurt and were trying to navigate their own complicated relationships with forgiveness and second chances. It became a rallying cry for those who refused to rush their healing process or cave to pressure to move on before they were ready. 3 weeks later, a handwritten letter arrived at Griffin's apartment. The return address showed it was from his grandmother, a woman he hadn't spoken to since his father's funeral 5 years earlier. Griffin, the letter read in her familiar spidery handwriting. I've been watching the news, and I think you might finally be turning into the man your grandfather always believed you could be. It's about time, boy. Love doesn't make us perfect, but it makes us brave enough to try. That same week, June began writing. It started as a journal entry, a way to process her complicated emotions, but gradually became something more. She found herself crafting a story about a woman who had spent her whole life being invisible until she learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is shine your light so brightly that others can find their way home. Griffin discovered the pages by accident when June left her notebook open on the kitchen table. The story was beautiful, raw, and achingly honest. Everything June was translated into prose that took his breath away. Without telling her, Griffin made a copy and sent it to an editor he knew, a woman who specialized in finding new voices and bringing untold stories to light. Some gifts, he was learning, were meant to be given in secret. Vivian Ashworth arrived at the library like a storm dressed in designer silk. Her heels clicked against the worn linoleum floors with the precision of a metronome, each step announcing her presence to anyone within earshot. She was everything June remembered from the society pages, tall, willowy, with the kind of effortless elegance that came from generations of privilege and a lifetime of knowing she belonged in every room she entered. June was shelving books in the biography section when she first spotted the familiar figure near the reference desk, and her blood ran cold. This was Griffin's ex-fiancée, the woman who had been photographed on his arm at countless galas and charity events, who had been mentioned in business journals as the perfect complement to the young heir's ambitions. Vivian's eyes swept the library with barely concealed disdain, taking in the modest space with its mismatched furniture and cheerful but outdated decorations. When her gaze finally landed on June, her smile was sharp as a blade hidden in silk. "You must be June," Vivian said, her voice carrying the kind of cultured accent that June had only heard in old movies. "I'm Vivian Ashworth. I was hoping we could have a little chat." June's hands tightened around the book she was holding, a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt that suddenly felt like armor against whatever was coming. "Griffin isn't here right now," she managed to say, proud that her voice came out steady. "Oh, darling, I'm not here to see Griffin," Vivian replied, her laugh like crystal tinkling against marble. "I'm here to see you. After all, you've caused quite the stir in our little world. I thought it was time we met properly." There was something predatory in Vivian's smile that made June's skin crawl, but she gestured toward the small seating area near the windows anyway. Whatever this woman had come to say, June would rather hear it than spend the rest of her life wondering. They sat across from each other like chess players preparing for battle, Vivian's posture perfect and predatory, June's more cautious but determined not to be intimidated. "I'll be direct," Vivian said, crossing her legs with practiced grace. "This whole experiment has been fascinating to watch, but don't you think it's gone on long enough? Griffin has made his point, proven whatever he needed to prove about himself. Now it's time for him to come home." The words hit June like a physical blow. Come home? To his real life, darling. To the world he actually belongs in. Vivian's voice was honey over poison. "Look, I understand why this has been appealing for him. Griffin always did love a project, a cause to champion. But you can't honestly believe this is sustainable, can you?" June felt something cold and familiar settling in her stomach, The old voice that had whispered cruel truths to her for years, telling her she wasn't enough, would never be enough, was foolish to think otherwise. "What exactly are you saying?" June asked, though part of her already knew. Vivian leaned forward conspiratorially. "I'm saying that Griffin is a good man who got caught up in trying to prove something to himself and others. But this performance has run its course. He belongs with people who understand his world, who can match his ambitions, who won't hold him back from becoming who he's meant to be." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of familiar footsteps. Griffin appeared in the doorway of the seating area, his face going white when he saw Vivian sitting across from his wife. "Vivian," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "What are you doing here?" She stood gracefully, her smile radiant as she moved toward him. "Griffin, darling, you look different. Tired, perhaps? All this do-gooding must be exhausting." June watched from her chair, feeling invisible again in the way she'd learned to hate. She could see the tension in Griffin's shoulders, the way his jaw tightened as Vivian placed a perfectly manicured hand on his arm. "You've made your point beautifully," Vivian continued, her voice pitched just loud enough for June to hear every word. "Everyone's very impressed with your social consciousness and your commitment to charity work. But surely you can see that this has gone far enough? It's time to come home, Griffin. Back to your real life." Griffin's response was quiet but firm. "My home isn't the same as it used to be, Vivian. My life isn't the same." "Oh, sweetheart," Vivian's laugh was patronizing, the sound of someone explaining reality to a confused child. "You've been manipulated by someone who saw an opportunity and took it. This woman has been playing a very clever game, making you feel guilty and responsible for her feelings. But you don't owe her a lifetime of penance for one thoughtless bet." June's breath caught in her throat. So Vivian knew about the bet. Of course she did. Griffin's old world had been watching and laughing from the beginning. "That's enough," Griffin said, his voice gaining strength. "You don't know what you're talking about." But June could see the doubt creeping into his eyes, the way Vivian's words were finding their mark. The old Griffin was still there beneath the surface, the man who had been raised to believe that love was a transaction and worthiness was measured in social currency. Vivian seemed to sense her advantage. "Griffin, you're one of the most eligible men in the country. You could have anyone be with someone who elevates you instead of someone who limits your potential. Don't throw your life away because you feel guilty about a harmless prank." That evening, the tension between Griffin and June finally exploded into their first real fight. They stood in his kitchen, the space that had once felt warm and domestic now crackling with unspoken accusations and fears. "She's right about one thing," June said, her voice shaking with barely controlled emotion. "I am holding you back. Every time we go out together, I can see people wondering what you're doing with me. Every interview you do, every charitable cause you support, there's an undertone of, look how noble he is for loving someone like her." "June, that's not—" "Let me finish," she interrupted, surprising them both with her vehemence. "I need to know something, Griffin. When you defend me, when you stand up for me, when you refuse to go back to your old life, are you protecting me? Or are you hiding me?" Griffin opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The question had hit something deep and uncomfortable, a truth he wasn't ready to examine. "I don't know how to answer that," he admitted quietly. "Then maybe you need to figure it out," June said, and walked out of his apartment for the first time since she'd started staying there. Griffin spent the next 3 days in a haze of confusion and self-doubt. He moved through his daily routines like a sleepwalker, Vivian's words echoing in his head alongside June's painful questions. Was he really protecting June, or was he protecting himself from having to fully commit to a life that would always require him to defend his choices? Meanwhile, June found herself at a women's support group that met weekly at the community center. She'd never attended before, but something about her conversation with Vivian had broken open a dam of pain she'd been holding back for years. The circle of women was diverse, different ages, backgrounds, and stories, but they shared a common thread of having survived the particular cruelty that the world reserved for women who didn't fit its narrow definitions of worthiness. When June's turn came to share, the words poured out of her like water from a broken levee. She talked about decades of being invisible, of believing that love was something that happened to other people, of the voice in her head that told her she was taking up too much space in a world that didn't want her. I spent so long believing I wasn't worthy of love that when someone finally said they loved me, I couldn't tell if it was real or if I was just so desperate that I convinced myself it was, she said through tears. And now I'm terrified that everything I thought was real is just another form of charity. The women listened without judgment, some nodding in recognition, others crying quietly for their own buried pain. For the first time in her life, June felt truly seen, not as an inspiration or a symbol or a project, but as a human being whose struggles mattered. On the fourth day of their separation, Griffin appeared at June's door carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. His eyes were red with exhaustion and something that might have been tears. "I had this made for you," he said quietly, holding out the package. "I should have asked your permission first, but I wanted you to see yourself the way I see you." June unwrapped the package with trembling fingers and found a beautifully bound book. Her story, the one she'd been writing in secret, now illustrated with delicate watercolors and printed on cream-colored paper that made her words look like poetry. The title page read, "The Woman Who Became a Lighthouse" by June Callahan, and below it, in smaller text, "For every woman who has ever felt invisible." "I sent it to an editor friend," Griffin explained, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to explain. "She wants to publish it. Not because you're my wife, not because it's a curiosity, but because it's beautiful and true and important." June opened the book with shaking hands, seeing her own words transformed into something that looked permanent, valuable, real. The illustrations captured not just the story, but the emotion behind it, the pain of invisibility, the slow awakening to self-worth, the complicated dance of learning to trust love. "I'm sorry," Griffin continued, his voice breaking. "I hide behind actions because I don't know how to just be. I don't know how to exist without performing, without proving something. But I'm learning, June. I'm trying to learn." The following week, June received an invitation that changed everything, a request to speak at Columbia University about body positivity and self-worth in literature. The audience would be hundreds of students and faculty members, and June's first instinct was to decline. But then she thought about the women in her support group, about her mother's belief that every person had a story worth telling, about the voice that had been growing stronger inside her since the day she'd first stood up to Griffin's cruelty. She accepted the invitation. Griffin asked if she wanted him to come with her, and when she said yes, he didn't ask to sit on the stage or to be introduced as her husband. He simply took a seat in the back of the auditorium like any other audience member. June's speech was powerful in its simplicity. She talked about the difference between being rescued and being seen, about the danger of making love a transaction where one person saves and the other person owes. "Love isn't rescue," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. "Love is witnessing. It's sitting with someone in their pain without trying to fix them. It's listening without judgment and staying without conditions." From his seat in the back, Griffin felt tears streaming down his face as he finally understood what June had been trying to tell him. She wasn't asking him to save her or to prove his devotion through grand gestures. She was asking him to see her, really see her, and to let himself be seen in return. When June's eyes found his across the crowded room, she didn't look away from his tears. Instead, she smiled, not the careful, guarded smile she'd been wearing for months, but the radiant expression he'd fallen in love with in the first place. And for the first time since Vivian's visit, Griffin felt like he might be home. The betrayal came from an unexpected source. Marcus Blackwell had been Griffin's roommate at Yale, a trust fund baby with a reputation for stirring up drama when his own life got too boring. What Griffin hadn't anticipated was that Marcus had been documenting everything from the beginning. Screenshots of text messages, recordings of phone calls, even copies of the original bet contract with all its cruel details spelled out in black and white. The expose appeared on the front page of the New York Post on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. The headline screamed in bold letters that made June's blood run cold. It was all a game. Millionaire's marriage began as sick bet. Below the headline were photographs Griffin had never seen, pictures of him laughing with his friends at various parties, images that had been taken before he'd even met June, but were now being used to paint him as a calculating predator. Worse were the text message screenshots, conversations from those early days that showed Griffin discussing June like she was a chess piece in some elaborate game. The most damaging evidence was a voice recording from the night of the original bet, Marcus's phone having captured Griffin's drunken agreement to the whole sordid arrangement. Hearing his own voice, younger, crueler, full of the casual arrogance that had once defined him, made Griffin physically ill. June discovered the story the same way she'd learned about their first media scandal, standing in a grocery store checkout line, watching her world crumble in real time. But this time, she didn't flee. She stood there reading every word, absorbing every cruel detail, feeling something crystallize inside her chest that felt like both ending and beginning. Her phone rang constantly for the next 3 days. Reporters, producers, bloggers, everyone wanted her reaction, her side of the story, her tears or her anger or her forgiveness. But June remained silent, and somehow that silence spoke louder than any statement could have. Griffin, meanwhile, was falling apart. He'd spent months building a new version of himself, working to become someone worthy of June's love, only to have his past self rise from the grave to destroy everything he'd fought to create. The shame was suffocating, made worse by the knowledge that this time he couldn't deny or deflect or explain away the truth. On Thursday afternoon, Griffin called a press conference. He stood at a podium in front of what seemed like every reporter in the city, his face gaunt and his hands shaking as he faced the cameras that would broadcast his confession to the world. "The reports about my marriage are true," he began, his voice steady despite the chaos in his heart. Everything began exactly as Marcus Blackwell described. "I agreed to marry June Callahan as part of a bet, a cruel game that treated another human being's heart like it was a prize to be won." The room erupted in questions, reporters shouting over each other to get their sound bites, but Griffin continued speaking as if he couldn't hear them. "I was a coward," he said, the words cutting through the noise like a blade. "I was selfish and entitled and completely without empathy. But June was never any of those things. She loved me when I didn't deserve it, forgave me when I didn't earn it, and showed me what it meant to be human when I'd forgotten how to be anything but a transaction." He paused, looking directly into the main camera as if he could reach June through the lens. "I take full responsibility for the pain I've caused. June owes the world nothing, no explanations, no forgiveness, no inspiration. The only person who needs to answer for this is me." The press conference ended with Griffin announcing that he was donating 80% of his personal wealth to organizations focused on body positivity, mental health awareness, and anti-bullying initiatives. It was a gesture that the media immediately began dissecting, some calling it genuine redemption, others dismissing it as an elaborate publicity stunt. But June wasn't watching when Griffin made his confession. She'd already disappeared. The cabin was a 2-hour drive north of the city, hidden among pine trees that had stood sentinel over June's childhood memories for decades. It was where her mother had brought her every summer until she was 12, a place of quiet lakes and wooden porches where time seemed to move differently. June arrived as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded her of her mother's watercolor paintings. The cabin was smaller than she remembered, weathered by years of abandonment, but it still felt like coming home. For 7 days, June existed in complete solitude. She wrote letters she would never send to Griffin, to her mother, to the girl she'd been before the world taught her to make herself small. She sang songs from her childhood while cooking simple meals on the ancient stove, her voice echoing through empty rooms that had once been filled with laughter. In the evenings, she sat on the dock with her feet dangling in water that reflected the stars, trying to separate her authentic feelings from the noise of public opinion and media scrutiny. Did she love Griffin despite his betrayal, or because of his transformation? Was forgiveness possible when trust had been shattered so completely? And most importantly, who was she when stripped away from the story everyone else wanted to tell about her life? Meanwhile, Griffin was losing his mind with worry. He searched everywhere he could think of: the library, the community center, even her mother's old house. Friends and neighbors hadn't seen her, and June's few close confidants refused to give him any information about her whereabouts. It was Maria, the friend who had made June's wedding dress, who finally stopped him outside the library on the 5th day of June's absence. "If you really love her," Maria said, her voice firm but not unkind, "you'll give her the space to figure out what she wants without your presence influencing her decision. Love isn't about what you need, Griffin. It's about what she needs." So Griffin waited. Every morning, he went to Fig Tree Square and sat on the bench where they'd had their first honest conversation. He brought a book and pretended to read, but mostly he just existed in the space where he'd first begun to understand what June meant to him. On the 8th day, as the morning sun filtered through the ancient fig tree's leaves, June appeared. She looked different, calmer somehow, like she'd found something in her solitude that had been missing before. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, and she wore a simple sundress that made her look younger, softer, but also stronger in some indefinable way. "I needed to know if I missed you, or if I just missed not being alone," June said as she approached the bench. "I needed to know if I wanted to come back to you, or if I was just afraid of starting over." Griffin stood slowly, afraid that any sudden movement might make her disappear again. "And what did you discover?" June smiled, and it was the same radiant expression that had first captured his heart in the library all those months ago. "I discovered that I want to come back. Not because I'm afraid of being alone, not because I feel sorry for you, not because the world expects it, but because I choose you, Griffin. I choose us." What happened next surprised them both. Griffin dropped to one knee, but instead of producing a ring, he pulled out a manila envelope that had been folded and carried in his jacket pocket for days. "These are divorce papers," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I had them drawn up because I want to give you a choice you never had before. I want to marry you again, June. Really marry you this time, without lies or bets or games. But only if you want to. Only when you're ready. Only if you choose me knowing exactly who I was and who I'm trying to become." June took the envelope with trembling hands, feeling the weight of possibility it contained. For the first time in their entire relationship, she held all the power. She could walk away clean, start fresh, build a life that belonged entirely to her. Or she could choose love, not as a rescue or a fairy tale, but as a conscious decision between two imperfect people who had learned how to see each other clearly. She leaned down and kissed Griffin's forehead, a gesture that felt like benediction and promise combined. "Let's live first," she said softly. "Let's figure out who we are when we're not trying to prove anything to anyone else. And then maybe we can choose each other again." Griffin rose to his feet, and they began walking home together. Not as husband and wife, not as symbols or cautionary tales, but as two people who had decided that love was worth the risk of being truly known. The envelope remained unopened in June's purse, a reminder that some choices were too important to rush. But as they walked side by side through the morning light, both of them felt something they'd never experienced before: the freedom that comes from choosing love with open eyes and an honest heart. The cottage sat on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic, painted the color of sea foam, and surrounded by wild roses that had been growing there longer than anyone could remember. It was nothing like Griffin's sterile penthouse or June's cramped apartment. This place had character etched into every weathered board and salt-stained window frame. They found it on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, while driving aimlessly along the coast, both of them desperate to escape the suffocating attention that had followed them since the truth about their marriage had exploded across every newspaper and social media platform in the country. The for sale sign was crooked and faded, and the realtor seemed surprised that anyone would be interested in such a modest property. "It needs work," the woman warned as she led them through rooms that smelled like ocean air and old memories. "The heating system is ancient, The kitchen appliances are from the 70s, and the whole place could use fresh paint. But June was already imagining herbs growing on the windowsills and books stacked on the built-in shelves that line the living room walls. Griffin watched her face transform as she explored each room, seeing possibilities where others might see problems, and he knew they'd found their sanctuary. "We'll take it," he said without consulting price or inspection reports or any of the practical considerations that would have governed his old life. The first thing June did after they moved in was plant daisies in the front yard. She worked with her hands deep in the dark soil, her face peaceful in a way Griffin hadn't seen in months. When he asked why she'd chosen that particular flower, she looked up at him with dirt smudged on her cheek and said, "Daisies are flowers of courage. They grow anywhere and bloom, even when conditions aren't perfect." Griffin took that as his personal challenge and announced he was going to learn to cook. The declaration would have been laughable to anyone who knew his previous lifestyle, a man who'd never prepared anything more complex than coffee suddenly attempting to master the art of domestic cuisine. His early efforts were disasters of epic proportions. Smoke alarms became dinner bells, and June learned to keep the fire extinguisher within easy reach. But there was something beautiful about watching Griffin approach cooking with the same determination he'd once brought to business deals. He studied recipes like legal documents, measured ingredients with scientific precision, and celebrated small victories, a perfectly poached egg, a soup that didn't burn, with the joy of a child discovering magic. The children from the library found them within a month. Word had spread through the small coastal community about the famous couple who'd moved into the old Morrison cottage, and curiosity eventually overcame caution. The first visitor was 8-year-old Tommy, who appeared at their door on a Saturday morning asking if it was true that Mr. Griffin told stories. "I don't really tell stories," Griffin admitted, feeling suddenly inadequate. "I'm not very good at making things up." "Then tell me about something real," Tommy said with the directness that only children possess. "Tell me about the biggest mistake you ever made." And so Griffin found himself sitting on his front porch, explaining to a child how sometimes adults make terrible choices because they're scared or angry or don't know how to be better. Tommy listened with the intensity of someone much older, nodding at the right moments and asking questions that forced Griffin to examine his own motivations more honestly than any therapist ever had. Soon other children followed. They came after school and on weekends, drawn by stories that were unlike anything they'd heard before, tales that didn't always have clear heroes and villains, where the prince sometimes started as the dragon and had to learn how to become worthy of love. June began writing these stories down, transforming Griffin's fumbling oral narratives into children's books that captured the emotional truth behind each tale. Her first attempt was about a lonely giant who lived in a tower and had forgotten how to be gentle until a wise sparrow taught him that strength could be tender. When she shyly showed Griffin her manuscript, he immediately volunteered to illustrate it, despite having no artistic training whatsoever. His drawings were charmingly amateur, stick figures with earnest expressions and houses that looked like they'd been drawn by a kindergartner. But June treasured every crooked line and uneven circle, tacking his illustrations to the refrigerator like proud artwork from a beloved child. The letters began arriving in late summer. At first, just a few each week, addressed to both of them, but clearly meant for anyone who might understand what it felt like to be different, unwanted, or convinced they were unworthy of love. The writers ranged from teenagers struggling with body image to elderly widows who'd given up on finding companionship. The letter that broke Griffin's heart came from a 10-year-old girl named Sarah in Ohio. Her handwriting was careful and precise, each letter formed with the concentration of someone who had something important to say. "Dear June and Griffin," it read, "my mommy showed me your pictures in the magazine and told me your story. I am fat like June, and the kids at school are mean to me. But seeing how Griffin looks at June makes me think maybe someone will look at me that way someday too. Thank you for showing me I can be loved just the way I am." Griffin read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in, and when they did, he collapsed into a kitchen chair and sobbed like his heart was breaking open. June found him there 20 minutes later, still clutching the letter, tears streaming down his face. "This," he managed to say through his crying, "this is the greatest achievement of my entire life. Not the business deals or the money or the recognition. This little girl believing she's worthy of love because she saw how I look at you." June's response to their newfound visibility was to retreat into music. She'd played piano as a child, but had abandoned it in her teens when self-consciousness about her body made her reluctant to perform in front of others. Now, in the privacy of their cottage, she began playing again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence as muscle memory returned. Griffin surprised her by having a small greenhouse built in their backyard, a glass sanctuary where June could nurture seedlings and tend plants year-round. He'd noticed how peaceful she became when working with growing things, how her face softened when coaxing life from soil and seeds. They were dancing in the kitchen when Griffin's anxiety attack hit. It was a rainy evening in October, and June had been playing jazz standards on her newly tuned piano while Griffin attempted to make pasta without destroying it. She'd wandered into the kitchen and pulled him into an impromptu dance, both of them laughing as they spun around the small space to music that drifted in from the living room. Then, without warning, Griffin's breathing became shallow and rapid. His hands started shaking, and the familiar panic that he'd thought he'd conquered came rushing back with devastating force. The old feelings of unworthiness, of being a fraud who didn't deserve happiness, crashed over him like a rogue wave. June didn't try to talk him out of it or offer empty reassurances. Instead, she simply held him, wrapping her arms around his trembling body and grounding him with her steady presence. She began singing softly, an old lullaby her mother had sung when nightmares made sleep impossible, her voice low and soothing against his ear. "You rewrote me," Griffin whispered when the worst of the panic had passed, his voice muffled against her shoulder. June pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, her hands gentle on his face. "No," she said firmly. "I didn't rewrite you, Griffin. I just learned to read you more carefully. The man you are now was always there, buried under fear and pain and bad habits. I just helped you remember how to let him breathe." Later that night, they stood together on their small deck, watching moonlight silver the waves that rolled endlessly toward shore. The silence between them was different now, not empty or awkward or filled with unspoken tensions, but complete and comfortable, like a conversation that had found its natural conclusion. For the first time in either of their lives, silence didn't feel like something that needed to be filled or fixed or explained away. It simply was peaceful and profound and full of the kind of contentment that comes from being exactly where you belong, with exactly the person who sees you most clearly. The cottage creaked gently around them, settling into the night like an old friend making itself comfortable. Somewhere in the distance, a foghorn sounded, and June leaned against Griffin's shoulder as they watched the lighthouse beams sweep across the water in steady, reassuring circles. They had found their rhythm at last, not the frantic pace of their early relationship or the careful distance of their reconciliation, but something sustainable and real. Love, they were learning, wasn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It was about choosing each other every day, even when it was difficult, even when the world was watching, even when they were afraid. And in that quiet moment on their deck, with salt air filling their lungs and the vast ocean stretching endlessly before them, they chose each other once again. 1 year, 365 days since the first cruel headline had shattered June's world and forced them both to confront the difference between performance and truth. Now, standing before the gleaming glass doors of the June Callahan Community Library, she could barely recognize the broken woman who had once hidden behind stacks of books, believing herself unworthy of love. The building was beautiful in its simplicity, warm brick and wide windows that invited natural light to illuminate the reading spaces within. Children's artwork decorated the walls, and comfortable seating areas created pockets of intimacy in the larger space. It was everything June had dreamed a library could be when she'd been just another underpaid librarian with big hopes and a bigger heart. The dedication ceremony drew hundreds of people from the community and beyond. Local families mingled with reporters who had come to document this chapter in a story that had captivated the nation. But the cameras felt different now, less intrusive, more respectful, as if even the media had learned something about dignity in the past year. June stood before the microphone in a simple navy dress that made her feel confident without feeling like she was wearing costume. Her hands were steady as she looked out at the crowd, her voice clear and strong when she began to speak. "A wise woman once told me that libraries aren't really about books," she said, her words carrying easily across the assembled crowd. "They're about possibility. They're about the radical idea that every person, regardless of their circumstances or their past or what the world thinks of them, deserves access to knowledge, to stories, to the tools that help us become who we're meant to be." Griffin stood toward the back of the crowd, having insisted that today should belong entirely to June. He watched her command the space with such natural grace that his chest ached with pride and something deeper, the profound gratitude of someone who had been given a gift he'd never expected to receive. "I've learned something about love in the past year," June continued, her eyes finding Griffin's across the sea of faces. "Real love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone who chooses to grow alongside you, who sees your flaws and decides to stay anyway, who believes in your capacity to become better even when you can't see it yourself." Her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom, each word earned through months of doubt and forgiveness, and the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust from the ground up. "This library represents second chances," June said as she moved toward the ribbon that stretched across the entrance. "Because if we've learned anything, it's that people can change, love can survive even terrible mistakes, and sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the ugliest first chapters." The applause was thunderous as June cut the ribbon, but Griffin barely heard it. He was too focused on the radiant joy on her face, the way she transformed from someone who tried to disappear into someone who could light up a room simply by believing in herself. After the ceremony, as June accepted congratulations and toured visitors through the new facilities, Griffin noticed a woman standing alone near the children's section. She was elegant but fragile-looking, with silver hair and the kind of posture that spoke of years spent trying to hold herself together through sheer force of will. It took him a moment to recognize his own mother. Eleanor Hale had barely spoken to Griffin since his father's funeral 5 years earlier. Their relationship had been complicated even before that, a careful dance of emotional distance orchestrated by a woman who had learned to protect herself by never getting too close to anyone, including her own son. Griffin watched from across the room as his mother approached June, her steps hesitant but determined. He couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see June's face soften with understanding as Eleanor spoke, her hands gesturing in the careful way of someone confessing something difficult. Then June did something that stopped Griffin's breath entirely. She embraced his mother. Not a polite social hug, but the kind of full, generous embrace that June gave to people who needed healing, regardless of whether they deserved it. That evening, Griffin found June in their garden, deadheading the roses that had bloomed magnificently in their second year by the sea. The air was soft with the scent of salt and flowers, and the last light of day painted everything in shades of gold and rose. "Why do you always forgive?" Griffin asked, settling beside her on the weathered garden bench they'd rescued from a yard sale. "My mother abandoned me emotionally for most of my childhood, and you hug her like she was family." June was quiet for a long moment, her fingers gentle as she tended to the roses that had learned to thrive in the coastal soil. "Because I learned something about carrying pain," she said finally. "It doesn't hurt the people who caused it. It just poisons the person holding onto it. Your mother is broken, Griffin. She's spent decades punishing herself for not knowing how to love properly. Why would I add to that burden?" Griffin felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of anger he'd carried for so long it had become part of his identity. June wasn't just forgiving his mother, she was teaching him how to forgive himself. The phone call came 3 weeks later. June's book, What Remains After, had found a publisher who understood its message and wanted to bring it to a wider audience. The manuscript had grown from her original story into something larger, a meditation on resilience, second chances, and the radical act of choosing hope even when the world seems determined to break you. "They want to know if you'd be interested in a book tour," Griffin said, hanging up the phone with a grin that lit up his entire face. June looked up from a children's story she was writing, her third, inspired by the kids who still visited their cottage on weekends, and felt that familiar flutter of possibility in her chest. "A year ago, I would have said no," she admitted. "I would have been too scared, too convinced that people wouldn't want to hear what I had to say. And now," June's smile was radiant, "now I think maybe it's time to stop hiding from my own voice." The decision to remarry came naturally, born not from external pressure or symbolic necessity, but from a simple desire to choose each other again with full knowledge of who they'd become. They planned the ceremony for a Saturday in October, when the leaves were just beginning to turn and the air carried the crisp promise of coming winter. This time, there were no photographers hidden in bushes, no magazine deals or publicity considerations. The ceremony took place under the ancient fig tree in the town square, where they'd had their first honest conversation, witnessed by the children from their storytelling sessions and a handful of close friends who had supported them through their darkest moments. June wore a dress the color of ocean blue, the same shade as Griffin's eyes when he was thinking deeply about something that mattered to him. It was simple and elegant, chosen because it made her feel like herself rather than like someone playing a role. Griffin's vows were written on a piece of paper that he'd folded and refolded so many times it was soft as fabric. When he spoke, his voice was steady but thick with emotion. "I can't promise you perfection," he said, his eyes never leaving June's face. "I can't promise that I won't make mistakes, or that every day will be easy, or that I won't sometimes struggle with the man I used to be. But I can promise you presence. I can promise that I will show up every day, ready to choose love over fear, honesty over comfort, growth over stagnation." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "You taught me that love isn't about being worthy, it's about being willing. Willing to be seen, to be vulnerable, to let someone else's happiness matter as much as your own. June, you didn't save me. You didn't fix me. You did something much more valuable. You believed I could save myself." When they kissed to seal their new marriage, it was different from their first wedding kiss. That one had been performed for cameras and strangers, tainted by lies and hidden motivations. This kiss was slow and deliberate, a promise made between two people who had learned the difference between being in love and choosing love. As the small crowd applauded and the children threw flower petals that drifted on the autumn breeze, June felt something settle in her chest that she'd never experienced before, the deep, unshakable certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the person who saw her most clearly. Later, as they walked home hand in hand through the quiet streets of their adopted town, June reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "You know what I've learned," she said, squeezing Griffin's hand as they paused to watch the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Not every mistake becomes a monster. Sometimes, if you're brave enough to face the truth and willing to do the work, mistakes can become miracles." Griffin stopped walking and turned to face her, his eyes bright with tears he no longer tried to hide. "You," he said simply, "are my miracle." And as they continued toward home, toward the life they had built together through honesty and forgiveness and the radical act of choosing each other every single day, both of them knew that their story was far from over. They had learned that the best love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other. They're about flawed, complicated, beautifully human people deciding that growing together is worth whatever challenges might come. Behind them, the fig tree stood sentinel in the gathering dusk, its ancient branches heavy with the weight of new beginnings and second chances, watching over a love that had learned how to bloom exactly where it was planted. So here we are at the end of a journey that began with cruelty and blossomed into something beautiful beyond imagination. Griffin and June's story forces us to confront some of the most uncomfortable questions about human nature and the possibility of redemption. What would you have done if you were June, standing in that grocery store, seeing your marriage exposed as a cruel joke for the entire world to witness? Would you have had the strength to walk away or the courage to stay and fight for something that might be real beneath all the lies? And if you were Griffin, could you have faced the mirror of your own cruelty and chosen transformation over self-destruction? This isn't just a love story, it's a testament to the radical power of second chances and the extraordinary courage it takes to love someone who has hurt you deeply. June didn't just forgive Griffin, she held space for him to become the man he was capable of being, even when the world told her she was foolish to try. She teaches us that healing isn't about forgetting the wounds we've received, but about refusing to let those wounds define our capacity for hope. Griffin shows us that true change requires more than apologies. It demands the daily choice to show up as a better person, even when no one is watching, even when the work is hard and uncomfortable and offers no guarantee of forgiveness. In a world that often feels divided between those who have been hurt and those who have caused harm, Griffin and June remind us that we are all capable of both. Their story whispers the revolutionary truth that maybe, just maybe, some mistakes are meant to crack us open so that light can finally get in. If this story touched something deep inside your heart, if it made you believe again in the possibility of transformation and real love, please share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Hit that like button if you believe in second chances, and don't forget to follow our channel for more stories that remind us what it means to be beautifully, imperfectly human. Because sometimes the love stories that heal us most are the ones that begin with broken people choosing to build something whole together.